What if I told you that some of the darkest secrets of American history were never written in ordinary ink, but carved into flesh, bound by blood, and whispered through generations as curses? In the shadowed corners of the South, where faith and fear walked hand in hand, families carried secrets so vile that the land itself seemed to bleed from their sins. One such family was the Rookes of Georgia, who in 1851 forged a pact that would twist religion, blasphemy, and human sacrifice into something unholy, a gospel not preserved on paper but bound in the skin of the damned. Keynote No. 1. In the year 1851, Georgia was a place caught between the tightening grip of progress and the lingering shadows of old superstitions that never loosened their hold on the people who worked the land. The South was restless, the soil rich but stained with the labor and blood of those forced to till it, and in the backwoods and far reaches of the plantations there grew whispered tales of curses, hauntings, and rituals older than the church bells that tolled on Sunday mornings. It was in this environment that the Rooke family thrived, a family that seemed to embody the contradictions of the age. To the outside world, they were wealthy, influential, and deeply religious, their attendance at church regular, their donations to the community generous, their words honeyed with piety. But to those who lived near their estate, who heard strange cries at night or saw candlelight flickering in the woods long after midnight, the Rookes were figures wrapped in dread. The year 1851 was not simply a marker of time, but a turning point, a year that carried with it an air of unease. Crops failed unexpectedly in some regions, strange illnesses spread among livestock, and preachers shouted about the wrath of God falling upon the sinful. Among the rural folk, every storm was seen as a warning, every misfortune a punishment, and families turned not only to their Bibles but to whispered remedies passed down from ancestors who believed in charms and curses as much as in Scripture. This was the world in which the Rookes carved their legacy, a world where superstition and religion blended seamlessly, creating fertile soil for a pact that would shock even those accustomed to tales of devils and spirits. Georgia in 1851 was divided between modern ambitions and the weight of old beliefs, and nowhere was this division clearer than in the Rooke estate. Their mansion stood proudly on land wrested from both earth and man, its wide halls adorned with imported furnishings, its gardens meticulously tended, its reputation glittering with wealth. Yet beneath this surface of refinement lay a darkness no drapery could cover. Servants whispered of forbidden rooms locked at all times, of gatherings held not in the parlor, but in the cellar where the air was heavy with incense, and muttered words not found in any prayer book. Neighbors recalled seeing figures robed in black crossing the fields at night, moving toward the woods where fires glowed faintly and shadows danced against the trees. The year marked the height of the family's influence, and it was during this time that the Rookes' desire for power became insatiable. Land was plentiful, money abundant, yet there was something missing, something they believed could only be granted through forces beyond the natural. The Rookes, like many of their time, cloaked their actions in the language of faith, speaking of salvation, redemption, and divine will, but beneath their holy words was an undercurrent of desperation. They were not content with blessings given freely from the pulpit. They sought guarantees written in blood, promises that required more than prayer. It was in 1851 that the pact was said to have been forged, and though no outsider ever witnessed the exact moment, the stories passed down paint a chilling image. A family gathered not to read from the good book, but to desecrate it, tearing apart pages and rewriting them with words they claimed were revealed in secret visions. Each passage twisted Scripture into blasphemy, replacing the names of saints with those of demons, replacing parables of mercy with incantations of cruelty. The Rookes believed they were recording a new gospel, one that would bind them not only to each other, but to something beyond human comprehension. The material upon which this gospel was written was no parchment, no paper pressed from pulp, but something grotesque that would forever mark the family as cursed in the eyes of those who discovered the truth. But before that grotesque work was completed, the atmosphere of 1851 Georgia provided the perfect cloak for such deeds. The land was dotted with churches, yet many communities remained isolated, bound by traditions and fears older than Christianity itself. Preachers railed against witchcraft, but in private some of the very same men sought charms against illness or consulted local healers for remedies. The Rookes exploited this contradiction, using the language of religion to hide the unspeakable acts they carried out. They appeared at church each Sunday, heads bowed, Bibles clutched, but those Bibles held more than Holy Scripture. They carried within them notes, symbols, fragments of the Pact they would soon bind in flesh. As word of the family's strange practices began to seep beyond their estate, neighbors found themselves torn between suspicion and fear. Few dared confront the Rookes directly, for their power was undeniable, their reach long, their temper rumored to be swift. Those who spoke too boldly against them often found misfortune at their door. A barn burned to the ground, livestock dead without explanation, illness spreading suddenly through a household. To the superstitious, these were signs of the Pact's power already at work. To the fearful, they were warnings to remain silent. The year 1851 thus became not only the beginning of the Rooke family's unholy covenant, but also the moment their reputation shifted irreversibly. They were no longer simply wealthy landowners with eccentric habits, but figures of whispered legend, names spoken only when fires burned low and shadows stretched long. The Pact was said to have tied them to something eternal, something that demanded sacrifice and devotion beyond the grasp of ordinary men, and though no one could yet prove what they had done, the evidence lay in the atmosphere itself. The Rooke estate seemed darker, its halls colder, its fields touched by an unseen presence. Visitors often left with a sense of dread they could not explain, as though the air itself pressed against their lungs. Thus, the year 1851 in Georgia is remembered not merely as a time in history, but as the birth of a tale that has lingered in the corners of Southern folklore for generations. A year when a family turned from faith to something far darker, and when the soil of their land became forever stained, not just with labor but with the weight of a promise no one dared to break. Keynote Note 2. The Rooke family was unlike most others in Georgia, not because of their wealth alone, but because of the shadow of mystery that seemed to hang over them, no matter how brightly they tried to polish their public image. They were landowners of significant influence, their estate sprawling across acres of fertile soil, their names spoken in local gatherings with a mixture of respect and unease. On the surface, they appeared to be pillars of society, attending church regularly, donating generously to the congregation, and presenting themselves as upholders of morality and tradition. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade, the Rookes were known by those closest to their land as something altogether different, a family bound not just by blood but by secrecy, a clan whose every generation seemed touched by strange happenings and unexplained misfortunes that others dared not question aloud. The patriarch of the family in 1851, Elias Rooke, was a man both commanding and unsettling. He carried himself with an air of authority that silenced most who crossed his path, but behind his stern eyes lingered something colder than discipline, a hunger for control that seemed to extend beyond the reach of the fields and the fortunes he had acquired. His wife, Margaret, was equally enigmatic, her piety outwardly unshakable, yet whispered to be only a mask for a deeper and more troubling devotion. Their children, too, carried the weight of this reputation. Some townsfolk swore that the Rooke children rarely mingled with others, their education conducted in isolation within the estate's walls, their knowledge of scripture disturbingly precise, yet filled with interpretations that unsettled even seasoned preachers. The family's wealth provided them with power, but it was the fear they inspired that ensured their dominance in the community. Stories circulated of servants who vanished without explanation, of travelers who passed near the estate and were never seen again, of strange markings carved into trees at the borders of Rookeland. These rumors often began in whispers, traded between neighbors over fences or shared quietly during market days, but they spread quickly and became part of the fabric of local lore. The Rookes did little to dispel such tales. In fact, some believed they cultivated the fear deliberately, for fear is a power more binding than respect. Unlike many families of their status, the Rookes were rarely seen at social gatherings beyond the church pews. They kept to themselves, their estate a fortress of both wealth and secrecy. The few who entered their home described grand halls filled with imported furniture, thick drapes that blocked out much of the sunlight, and walls lined with shelves of books that seemed far too numerous for a family of their kind. These books, it was said, were not only volumes of history and scripture, but also rare texts written in languages few in Georgia could understand. Some believed the Rookes were scholars, others that they were heretics. What was certain was that the family's knowledge reached far beyond the ordinary education of their peers, and it was this knowledge that many suspected became the foundation of their eventual pact. Their relationship with religion was complex and troubling. While they attended services with a devotion that made them appear model parishioners, their interpretations of faith often caused unease. Elias Rooke was known to quote scripture with unsettling intensity, twisting its meaning to suit his arguments. Margaret was said to lead private gatherings within their home, where hymns were sung not in the familiar tones of the congregation, but in strange, drawn-out chants that echoed unnervingly. The children, when pressed to recite verses, spoke them with a precision that felt more memorized than heartfelt, as though their faith was a performance rehearsed for the world rather than a true belief. It was not only their spiritual practices that fueled suspicion, but also the uncanny timing of their prosperity. While neighboring families suffered losses from blighted crops, livestock diseases, and financial hardships, the Rookes seemed untouched by misfortune. Their fields thrived, their wealth grew, and their household expanded in strength even as others faltered. This disparity was not dismissed as luck. It was seen as a sign of something darker. People muttered that the Rookes had bargained for their fortune, that their prosperity was purchased at the cost of something hidden, something unspeakable. Such whispers would later evolve into the more chilling truth of their pact. But even before that truth was known, the family's success carried the taint of suspicion. The Rooke estate itself became a source of unease. Travelers described the land as strangely quiet, the kind of silence that seemed heavy rather than peaceful. Animals avoided the borders of the property, and the woods surrounding the mansion held an unnatural stillness. Those who ventured too close often reported feeling watched, as though unseen eyes followed them from the shadows. At night, the estate was said to glow faintly with candlelight in rooms that should have been dark, and some claimed to hear faint chanting carried on the wind. Whether these were the exaggerations of fearful imaginations or the truth of what the Rookes practiced, no one could say with certainty, but the result was the same. The family was feared as much as they were admired. Generations of Rookes before Elias had carried reputations for secrecy and cruelty, and in many ways 1851 was simply the culmination of a lineage already steeped in darkness. The family's ancestors were remembered for disputes with neighbors that ended in sudden deaths, for unexplained fires that destroyed the homes of rivals, for a pattern of misfortune that seemed always to benefit the Rookes in the end. This legacy lingered in the minds of the townsfolk, who saw Elias not as an exception, but as the natural continuation of a cursed bloodline. To them, the family was not just wealthy landowners, but keepers of an ancient and malevolent inheritance. Thus, the Rooke family in 1851 was a paradox of appearances and realities, respected in public yet reviled in whispers, devout in the eyes of the church yet heretical in their private rituals, prosperous beyond measure yet surrounded by suspicion. They were a family whose influence stretched far beyond their land, whose presence shaped the fears and imaginations of an entire community, and whose name would soon be forever linked with the most horrifying pact ever whispered in the history of Georgia. The horrific pact of the Rooke family was not born from a sudden decision, nor from a moment of weakness, but from years of carefully cultivated desire, whispered conversations in the darkened halls of their estate, and a hunger that could not be satisfied by ordinary means. The Rookes had wealth, they had land, and they had influence over their community, yet none of these things filled the void that gnawed at them. Elias Rooke and his kin believed that their legacy required more than material power, that their place in history demanded something eternal, something that could not be taken away by fortune's fickle hand. It was this obsession with permanence and control that led them down a path where salvation and damnation blurred into a single pursuit. The pact itself was said to have been sealed during a night when the air was heavy with storm and the land trembled under thunder that shook the fields. Witnesses from afar reported seeing strange fires burning in the woods, flames that did not flicker like ordinary torches but glowed with a steady, unnatural light. The family gathered in the cellar of their estate, a place rumored to stretch deeper underground than most realized, where the walls were lined with symbols carved not by carpenters, but by hands that sought to summon forces beyond comprehension. In that chamber, the Rookes began the ritual that would forever mark their name in whispers and fear. Unlike the simple oaths spoken between men, their pact demanded sacrifice. It was not enough to merely promise loyalty or to sign one's name to parchment. The Rooks believed they were communing with something that required proof of devotion, proof carved into both flesh and spirit. The family bound themselves together by blood, each member offering not only their own, but something far darker. The stories speak of servants who disappeared around this time, of travelers who wandered too close to the estate and were never seen again, their absence explained only in hushed voices that linked them to the ritual. Some claimed that the screams of the lost could be heard beneath the earth, echoing from the very cellar where the pact was sealed. The nature of the agreement itself was twisted and blasphemous, a distortion of the very faith the Rooks pretended to uphold. They took the language of the gospel and rewrote it, turning sacred words into incantations, parables into commands for cruelty, and promises of salvation into demands for suffering. The pact was both a covenant and a contract, one that promised the Rooks prosperity, influence, and protection from misfortune, but only if they upheld their side of the bargain. That side required continual offerings, not only of devotion but of life itself. It was said that every year the family was required to renew their commitment through sacrifice, feeding the gospel they had created with blood and binding its power tighter to their line. What made the pact especially horrific was not only its reliance on human suffering, but the deliberate way the Rooks cloaked it in the guise of holiness. To their community they were devout Christians, and to their victims they often presented their rituals as a form of salvation, convincing the weak or the desperate that they were chosen for a higher purpose. These twisted sermons were delivered not in the church, but in the hidden chamber of their estate, where candles burned black and the air was thick with smoke and incense. Elias would speak with a voice heavy with authority, Margaret would lead hymns that echoed like dirges, and the children would watch and learn, ensuring the pact would not die with their parents but would pass on through the bloodline. There were those who suspected the truth but lacked the courage to confront it. A minister once attempted to challenge Elias directly, warning that his interpretation of Scripture was blasphemous, but within days the man fell ill and died under mysterious circumstances. Another neighbor who spoke too loudly of his suspicions lost his barn to fire in the middle of a stormless night, the flames burning so hot they left nothing but charred earth. Over time these incidents accumulated, and the people of the surrounding lands chose silence over confrontation, preferring to live with the fear of the Rooks rather than risk inviting their wrath. The pact also influenced the very land around the estate. Crops grew unnaturally well within the Rooke fields while neighboring farms struggled with blight. Livestock thrived under their care yet perished inexplicably on others' lands. Storms seemed to split and scatter around their property, sparing their holdings while wreaking havoc elsewhere. Such unnatural fortune could not be explained away, and those who observed it with wary eyes knew the truth even if they could not speak it. The Rooks' prosperity was not a gift of God, but a payment of blood, secured through a bargain that defied both heaven and earth. What was most chilling about the pact, however, was the unity with which the family embraced it. There was no rebellion among them, no dissenting voice recorded in the stories passed down. From Elias to Margaret to their children, each played a role, each offered themselves willingly to the covenant. They were not victims of circumstance but active participants, their bond not merely familial but ritualistic, tied together by something stronger than love and darker than fear. They saw themselves as chosen, as keepers of a gospel that the world was not ready to receive, and they carried this delusion with unwavering conviction. Thus, the horrific pact of the Rooke family became more than a rumor, more than folklore. It was a truth etched into the marrow of their name, a covenant whispered in firelit woods, sealed with blood in the cellar of their estate, and bound forever to the legacy of Georgia's darkest tales. Keynote No. 4. The gospel created by the Rooke family was not a mere book, but a grotesque relic that blurred the line between faith and blasphemy, scripture and sorcery, salvation and damnation. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared as a collection of writings bound in leather, yet to those who dared to look closer, it revealed its horror. Its cover was not cowhide nor any animal skin but human flesh, preserved and treated with methods known only to those who created it. The stitching that held it together was coarse and uneven, as though done in haste, with sinew that seemed to pulse faintly under certain lights. Those who later claimed to have seen the book said it gave the impression of being alive, the surface warm to the touch, almost as though it breathed. This alone was enough to condemn it as an object of nightmare, but what lay within its pages was far worse. Inside the Gospel were passages written in careful hand, yet the words themselves carried no comfort. They twisted familiar verses of Holy Scripture into something unrecognizable, bending sacred teachings into perverse instructions. The opening lines mocked the creation story, replacing light with darkness, replacing God's breath with a whisper said to belong to something ancient and nameless. The Beatitudes became curses, the Psalms became invocations, and where once there were promises of life everlasting, the Rooke Gospel promised dominion purchased through death. It was both meticulous and monstrous, each word chosen not for beauty or faith, but for power and fear. The ink used for the writings was no ordinary substance. Rumors persisted that it was drawn from blood, carefully preserved and mixed with ash, creating a pigment that stained the pages with a faint metallic sheen. Under candlelight, the writing seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the words themselves were alive, crawling across the page to evade the gaze of the reader. Some believed that those who attempted to read it aloud were struck by madness, their voices cracking as though something otherworldly joined them in reciting the text. Others said that to gaze upon its passages too long was to feel one's soul pulled downward, drawn toward the same darkness the Rookes had bound themselves to. The book was not simply written once and closed. It demanded additions, and the family obliged. Each generation of Rookes was said to add to the Gospel, writing new chapters in blood, recording fresh sacrifices as if they were divine commandments. The book grew heavier with each offering, not merely in weight, but in the dreadful sense of presence it exuded. Children born into the family were made to contribute to it, their first rites not baptisms but offerings inked onto the cursed pages. The Gospel was a living document, not static but evolving, and through it the Pact was kept alive. The rituals surrounding the Gospel were as chilling as the artifact itself. The book was never displayed openly but kept locked within a chest bound with iron, hidden in the cellar of the Rooke estate. On nights chosen by the family, the chest was opened. The book laid upon an altar carved from stone said to have been taken from an ancient burial ground. Candles of black wax were lit, their flames producing a smoke that stung the eyes, and hymns were sung in tones that warped familiar melodies into dirges. The Gospel was then read aloud by Elias or Margaret, their voices echoing in the chamber while the children repeated in unison, their young voices carrying words that no child should ever have known. The book demanded not only worship but offerings, and it was in these ceremonies that the flesh of the missing was said to become the very material of its preservation. What made the Gospel so horrific was not only the atrocities that created it, but the conviction with which the family treated it as holy. To the Rookes, it was scripture truer than the Bible itself, a covenant that gave them prosperity and power in exchange for devotion and blood. They prayed to it, they kissed its cover, and they taught their children to hold it as sacred. This belief system replaced genuine faith with something monstrous, binding the family in a cycle that no one dared to break. The book became the centerpiece of their legacy, an heirloom passed not with pride but with dread, yet always carried forward because to abandon it was to risk the wrath of the very forces it represented. Those who claimed to have encountered the Gospel after the family's time spoke of its influence lingering even when closed. Some said that simply being near it filled them with nausea, that the air grew heavier, colder, as though life itself retreated from its presence. Others reported dreams of fire and shadow after seeing it once, dreams that returned night after night as if the book had marked them. Folklore insisted that attempts to destroy it always failed, that fire would not consume it and blades would not cut it. Instead, those who tried to rid the world of it often met violent ends, accidents or illnesses that came swiftly and unnaturally. The Gospel of the Rookes thus became more than just a family's private scripture. It was a relic of horror, a book that blurred the line between object and entity, between faith and curse. It represented the very heart of the Rooke Pact, its pages a record of blasphemy and blood, its presence a reminder that what the family created in 1851 did not simply fade away with their deaths. It endured, carried forward by hands unwilling to release it, hands bound as much by fear as by devotion, ensuring that the Gospel remained not a forgotten artifact, but a living horror tied eternally to the name of the Rookes. Keynote No. 5. The legacy of the Rooke family's pact was one that stretched far beyond their own lifetimes, casting a shadow that lingered over Georgia long after their mansion's walls had begun to decay and their fields had changed hands. Unlike simple tales of greed or cruelty that fade with the generations, the Rooke story endured because it was more than history. It was a haunting woven into the very soil of the land. Those who lived near the estate swore that even decades later the air carried with it a heaviness, as if the earth itself remembered the pact and refused to let the memory die. Farmers who inherited parcels of land that once belonged to the Rookes complained of sleepless nights, of livestock growing restless for no reason, of crops failing despite fertile soil, as though the land had been cursed by what had transpired upon it. The descendants of the Rookes carried the heaviest burden, for the pact was not bound only to the original family members, but to their bloodline. Children born into the family after 1851 were said to show signs of affliction almost from birth. Some were sickly and pale, others strangely quiet, with eyes that seemed to hold knowledge far beyond their years. In certain generations, the firstborn never lived past adolescence, a pattern so consistent that locals claimed it was the pact collecting its price. These tragedies did not bring pity from neighbors, but fear, for each death was seen not as misfortune but as payment, and each survival as a sign that the pact demanded continuation. Families who married into the Rooke line often found themselves plagued by misfortune as well, their names tainted by association, their fortunes dwindling as if cursed by proximity. Whispers of the Rooke gospel never ceased, and in time it passed into local folklore as a forbidden object, a book that should never be read but was always sought after by those driven by curiosity or greed. Treasure hunters, scholars, and even preachers came in search of it, drawn by rumors of its existence and the promise of uncovering its secrets. Few ever returned with anything more than fear. Stories told of men who claimed to have found the gospel, but who within days either disappeared or descended into madness. Some were discovered raving in the woods, muttering fragments of twisted scripture, their hands raw from clawing at their own skin. Others vanished entirely, their belongings left behind as though they had stepped willingly into the dark. The gospel's reputation grew with each story, transforming it from a hidden family secret into one of the most dreaded relics of the South. Even those who never saw the book felt the weight of the Rooke legacy. Locals avoided the ruins of the estate, and children were warned never to wander too close, for it was said that the ghosts of the Rookes still roamed the land, bound by the pact they had sworn. Travelers passing through at night reported strange lights flickering among the trees, voices chanting in the distance, and the sound of pages turning in the wind, though no book could be seen. The legend spread beyond Georgia, whispered along roads and through towns until the name Rooke became synonymous with unholy bargains and cursed bloodlines. The church attempted to bury the tale, condemning it as superstition, yet even ministers avoided speaking the family's name from the pulpit. Their silence only added to the fear, for if the men of God would not confront it, what hope did ordinary folk have? In time, the Rooke story became part of a wider pattern of Southern Gothic lore, a reminder of how easily faith could be twisted into something monstrous, how greed for eternal power could corrupt not just individuals, but entire families. To historians, it was a tale of a wealthy clan who overstepped the boundaries of morality, but to those who lived in its shadow, it was more than history. It was a warning. The legacy also lived on through objects that were said to have survived from the Rooke estate. A mirror cracked down its center that reflected faces not quite as they were, a candlestick that would not extinguish no matter how hard one tried, fragments of hymns written in the margins of ordinary prayer books that turned prayers into invocations. These artifacts were passed from hand to hand, often bringing misfortune with them, until they vanished into private collections or were hidden away by families too fearful to destroy them. Each relic became a piece of evidence that the Rooke legacy was not confined to memory, but persisted in tangible forms that defied explanation. Most haunting of all was the idea that the gospel itself still survived, waiting in silence for those bold or foolish enough to seek it out. Folklore claimed it had been hidden before the estate finally collapsed, buried in a place where the soil never grew grass, where animals refused to graze. Others believed it had passed into the hands of another family, adopted in secret by those who wished to claim its power for themselves. The uncertainty of its fate only deepened the fear. For as long as the book's existence remained unconfirmed, its influence could never be truly silenced. Thus, the Rooke family's legacy was one of endurance, a story that refused to die, a curse that refused to loosen its grip. Generations after Elias and Margaret had drawn their last breath, their pact still echoed in whispers, in nightmares, in the superstitions of the South. Their name became both a warning and a curse, invoked by parents to frighten their children, by preachers to remind their flocks of the dangers of straying from true faith, and by those who gathered around fires on stormy nights to tell tales that chilled the blood. The Rookes were gone, but their gospel, their pact, and their legend remained. A dark inheritance that proved some bargains are never truly broken,